Sometimes love demands the ultimate sacrifice. This is a story about courage, hope, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her children. In the face of impossible odds, one woman's love became a legacy that changed lives forever. Maria sat alone in her dimly lit kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound filling the silence. The smell of brewed coffee lingered, though she hadn't taken a sip. Her gaze drifted to the cracked tiles on the floor, but her mind was far from the imperfections of her home. She had spent the entire day replaying the doctor's words in her head, words that had shattered the fragile sense of stability she had been clinging to. Maria, it's cancer. Early stage, but aggressive. Without treatment, it will worsen. But with the twins. The doctor had paused, his voice heavy with regret. You'll need to terminate the pregnancy if you want to survive. The word terminate hung in the air like a cruel punishment. She instinctively placed her hands over her growing belly, feeling the subtle movements of life within, her babies, her light. Maria had spent her entire life fighting. First, it was the poverty that defined her childhood, then the heartbreak of a failed marriage, and now this. Her ex-husband had left her when life became inconvenient, disappearing without a second thought when she told him she was pregnant. Yet, despite all that, Maria had survived. She worked long hours at a local diner, saved every penny she could, and prepared herself to welcome her children into the world. They were the only reason she pushed through each grueling day. But now, with cancer looming over her, she was being forced to make an impossible choice. Sacrifice her babies to save herself, or risk it all to bring them into the world. The thought of giving up on them was unbearable. Every kick, every flutter inside her reminded her of the love she already had for them. They were her reason to keep going. She whispered to herself, "You're my hope, my everything. I can't lose you." Just as Maria was trying to steady her thoughts, a sharp knock echoed through the small apartment. She sighed, already knowing who it was. Her older brother Victor had a knack for showing up uninvited, especially when he thought he could fix things. "Maria, open up!" Victor's voice boomed from the hallway. With reluctance, Maria unlocked the door. Victor walked in briskly, his sharp suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the modest surroundings. Without even sitting down, Victor got straight to the point. "I just talked to your doctor. What are you thinking, Maria?" His tone was sharp, almost scolding. "You're seriously going to keep the pregnancy, knowing what's at stake?" Maria looked away, her hand instinctively covering her belly. "Victor, I've made my decision," she said softly but firmly. Victor scoffed, throwing his hands in the air. "Decision? Maria, this isn't just about you. You're carrying twins and you have cancer. Do you even understand how dangerous this is?" Maria turned to face him, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "I know exactly how dangerous this is, Victor, but I'm not giving up on them." Victor's disbelief was palpable. "Giving up? Maria, you don't even have the means to raise one child, let alone two. You're broke, you're sick, and now you're willing to throw your life away for what? A dream?" Maria's voice trembled, but she refused to back down. "They're not just a dream, Victor. They're real. They're my children, and I'm their mother." Victor shook his head in frustration. "You don't understand, Maria. If you die, what happens to them? Who's going to take care of them? Me? You think I can just drop everything and become a father to two kids?" Maria's heart ached at his words, but she wasn't surprised. Victor had always been practical, almost to a fault. But this wasn't about him. "I'm not asking you to take care of them, Victor. I'm asking you to support me, to believe in me, just this once." Victor's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "I do believe in you, Maria. That's why I'm telling you this. You need to think about yourself for once. If you don't, you'll leave those kids with nothing but heartbreak." Maria stepped closer, her voice steady despite the tears welling up in her eyes. "Victor, I've made my choice. These babies are my light, my hope. Even if it costs me everything, I'm keeping them." Victor sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "You're so stubborn," he muttered. "You're going to do what you want, no matter what anyone says, aren't you?" Maria didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was answer enough. Victor left shortly after, muttering under his breath about Maria's stubbornness. As the door closed behind him, the apartment felt even quieter than before. Maria walked over to the corner of the living room where an old crib sat. It was a hand-me-down from a neighbor, its paint chipped and faded, but to Maria, it was a symbol of hope. She gently ran her fingers along the edge of the crib, imagining the day her babies would lie there, safe and sound. Despite Victor's harsh words and the looming threat of cancer, Maria knew she was making the right decision. She sat by the window, watching as the last rays of sunlight faded into the horizon. Her hand rested protectively on her belly as she whispered, "You're my everything, and I'll fight for you with everything I have." As the night deepened, Maria allowed herself a rare moment of peace. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with pain, uncertainty, and sacrifice. But she was ready. For her babies, she would endure it all. They were her light in the darkness, and she would fight for them until her last breath. Maria's days had become an exhausting cycle of work and pain. Each morning, she dragged herself out of bed, her body aching from the weight of the pregnancy and the relentless grip of her illness. At the diner where she worked as a waitress, the once simple tasks of carrying trays and refilling coffee cups now felt like climbing a mountain. But Maria endured. She smiled at customers, ignored the throbbing pain in her chest, and whispered silent prayers for strength. Her world had shrunk to three things: the babies growing inside her, the bills she struggled to pay, and the ever-present reminder of her diagnosis. The cancer was a shadow she couldn't escape, its presence growing stronger with every passing day. Yet, despite the fear and uncertainty, Maria found moments of hope. Every kick, every flutter inside her reminded her of why she was fighting. "I can do this," she told herself again and again. "For them, I can do anything." One late afternoon, as Maria cleaned her tiny apartment, exhaustion took its toll. She had spent hours scrubbing floors, rearranging furniture, and folding baby clothes she had collected from thrift stores. With a sigh, she climbed onto a stool to reach the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet. Her hand trembled as she stretched for a box of baby blankets, her vision blurring slightly. And then it happened. The stool wobbled beneath her weight. Maria's hand instinctively shot out to steady herself, but she missed. The next thing she knew, she was falling. Time seemed to slow as she felt her body twist midair, her arms flailing in a futile attempt to grab hold of something, anything. She hit the floor hard, the impact sending a searing pain through her lower abdomen. Maria screamed, clutching her belly as tears streamed down her face. The pain was unlike anything she had ever felt, sharp and unrelenting. She tried to move, but her body refused to cooperate. Minutes felt like hours as Maria lay on the cold kitchen floor, her breaths shallow and labored. She didn't have the strength to call for help, but her muffled cries reached the ears of her neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, an elderly woman who lived next door. "Maria, are you okay?" Mrs. Lopez called out as she knocked on the door. When there was no response, she grew more concerned and used the spare key Maria had given her for emergencies. The sight that greeted her made Mrs. Lopez's heart sink. Maria lay crumpled on the floor, her face pale and contorted in pain. Without hesitation, Mrs. Lopez called for an ambulance, her hands trembling as she relayed the situation to the dispatcher. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur. Maria drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind foggy from the pain. By the time they arrived, a team of doctors was already waiting to assess her condition. Bright lights and urgent voices filled the room as Maria was wheeled into the emergency unit. She could hear fragments of conversations around her, words like fetal distress, internal bleeding, and emergency surgery cut through the haze. Her heart pounded, panic surging as she clung to one thought: the babies. "Please," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Save them. Save my babies." A nurse gently placed a hand on her shoulder, her face etched with concern. "We're doing everything we can, Maria. Just hold on." And with that, Maria closed her eyes, surrendering to the darkness that pulled her under. Dr. Ethan Carter, the lead obstetrician, studied Maria's chart with a grave expression. He turned to his team and spoke with urgency. "She's suffered significant trauma to her abdomen. If we don't act fast, we could lose all three of them, mother and babies." The room buzzed with activity as nurses prepped Maria for an emergency ultrasound. The results were dire. The babies were in distress, and Maria's condition was rapidly deteriorating. As Maria was being stabilized, Victor burst into the waiting room, his face flushed with a mix of anger and panic. He had received a frantic call from Mrs. Lopez and had driven straight to the hospital. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the corridor. A nurse quickly explained the situation, but Victor's frustration boiled over. He pushed past her and confronted Dr. Carter. "You're the doctor, right?" Victor snapped. "What's the plan here? Because whatever you're doing, it's not working. My sister shouldn't even be in this position." Dr. Carter remained calm, his voice steady. "Mr. Victor, your sister is in critical condition. We need to perform an emergency C-section to save the babies, but it's incredibly risky. Maria's body may not survive the procedure." Victor threw his hands in the air. "I told her this would happen. I told her months ago she was making a mistake keeping the pregnancy. And now look where we are." Dr. Carter took a step closer, his tone firm but empathetic. "Victor, I understand your frustration, but right now, Maria needs our support. These babies need our support. I'm asking you to trust me to do what's best for all of them." Victor shook his head, pacing back and forth. "And what happens if she doesn't make it? Who's going to take care of those kids? Me? I can barely take care of myself." Dr. Carter's gaze softened. "Victor, I know you're scared, but your sister has fought this hard for her children. She believes in giving them a chance, and I do too. I can't promise a perfect outcome, but I can promise I'll do everything in my power to save them." Victor stopped pacing and stared at the floor, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he muttered. "Do what you have to do, but don't come to me when things fall apart." As Victor stormed out of the room, Dr. Carter turned to his team. "Prep the OR," he instructed. "We don't have much time." He glanced through the glass window at Maria, who lay unconscious on the hospital bed. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, but even in her fragile state, there was a quiet strength about her. Dr. Carter took a deep breath, steeling himself for the task ahead. He knew the risks, knew the odds were stacked against them, but he also knew that Maria's love for her children deserved every ounce of effort he could give. The medical team moved quickly, the sterile environment of the operating room charged with tense energy. Machines beeped steadily as Maria's vitals were monitored, and the team of surgeons and nurses readied themselves for the delicate procedure. Outside, in the waiting room, Victor sat alone. His head was in his hands, his mind a storm of emotions, guilt, anger, fear, and a flicker of helpless hope. Despite his harsh words, he silently prayed for his sister and her babies, even as doubt gnawed at him. Meanwhile, inside the OR, Dr. Carter stood poised, the scalpel in his hand. "Let's begin," he said, his voice steady, though the weight of what was at stake pressed heavily on his chest. The room fell silent, except for the rhythmic hum of machines and the soft clinking of surgical instruments. Every movement was deliberate, every second critical. This was a fight for 3 lives, and Dr. Carter was determined to win. Maria's eyes fluttered open, and the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room made her squint. Her entire body ached, the pain radiating from her abdomen as if her very core was breaking apart. She struggled to focus, her thoughts clouded by exhaustion and fear. The steady beeping of the monitors filled the silence, a stark reminder of how fragile her situation was. Slowly, her gaze moved to the blurry figure standing by her bedside. As her vision cleared, she recognized him, Dr. Ethan Carter, the man who had promised to fight for her and her babies. "Maria," Ethan said gently, his voice calm but tinged with urgency. "We're preparing for surgery. The babies are in distress, and we don't have much time." Maria nodded weakly, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. Will they be okay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan crouched down so their eyes were level. "I'll do everything I can to save them." "But, Maria, this is risky. Your body has been through so much already." Maria took a shaky breath, her eyes glistening with tears. She knew what he wasn't saying out loud. She might not survive this. "If I don't make it," Maria began, her voice trembling, promise me you'll take care of them. They're all I have. They're everything." Ethan hesitated, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. "I promise," he said finally, his voice firm. "But you need to fight too, Maria, for them." Maria managed a faint smile. "I've been fighting my whole life, Dr. Carter. I'm ready for whatever comes next." In the operating room, the tension was palpable. Nurses and doctors moved quickly, their hands steady but their faces strained. The air buzzed with the hum of machines, the soft clink of surgical tools, and the focused murmurs of the medical team. Ethan stood at the head of the table, his gloved hands poised and ready. He took a deep breath, his mind replaying every step of the procedure. There was no room for error, not when 3 lives were at stake. "Let's begin," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The initial stages of the surgery went smoothly. The first incision was made with precision, and Ethan worked quickly to access the babies. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of Maria's heart monitor. But then, just as they were about to deliver the first baby, the monitor let out a sharp, erratic beep. Ethan's head snapped up. "Her blood pressure is dropping," one of the nurses said urgently. "Give me suction," Ethan ordered, his tone calm but firm. "We're losing too much blood." The team worked frantically to stabilize Maria. Bags of blood were hung, fluids were pumped, and medications were administered in rapid succession. Ethan's hands moved with practiced precision, his focus unwavering despite the chaos around him. "Stay with me, Maria," he murmured under his breath. "We're almost there." The first baby was delivered moments later, a tiny, fragile life that let out the faintest, miraculous cry. Ethan handed the baby off to a waiting pediatric team, then immediately turned his attention to the second. "She's still losing blood," a nurse warned, panic creeping into her voice. "Keep the transfusion going. Increase fluids," Ethan commanded. His jaw tightened as he carefully worked to deliver the second baby. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the second baby was out. A little boy, his cries louder and stronger than his sister's. Ethan allowed himself a brief moment to breathe as he handed the boy to the pediatric team. But his relief was short-lived. "She's crashing," another nurse called out, the alarm from the heart monitor blaring. Ethan's focus shifted entirely to Maria. He moved quickly to address the hemorrhaging, his hands steady even as his heart raced. "We're not losing her," he said through clenched teeth. For what felt like hours, the team worked tirelessly, balancing on a knife's edge between life and loss. Finally, the bleeding slowed, and Maria's vitals began to stabilize. As the last stitches were placed and the machines returned to a steady rhythm, Ethan stepped back, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. He looked over at the 2 tiny babies, now safely in incubators, their fragile chests rising and falling with the rhythm of life. Then he turned to Maria, still unconscious but alive. "She made it," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines and the soft cries of newborns, Ethan allowed himself to feel the weight of what had been accomplished, a fragile but extraordinary victory. Finally, the first baby was delivered, a tiny, fragile girl with a faint cry that pierced the room. The sound brought a momentary wave of relief to the team, but Ethan's focus remained razor-sharp. "Baby girl is out," a nurse announced, quickly handing the infant to the neonatal team. "Heartbeat is steady." Ethan didn't pause. "Let's get the second one," he said, already moving to deliver the boy. Minutes later, the second baby, a boy, was born, his cry louder and stronger than his sister's. Ethan let out a small sigh of relief, but it was fleeting. Maria's condition was deteriorating rapidly. As the babies were whisked away for immediate care, Ethan turned his attention back to Maria. Her heart rate was dangerously low, her body struggling to keep up with the trauma it had endured. "Maria, stay with us," Ethan urged, his voice breaking through the haze of noise. But Maria's eyes fluttered open just briefly, her face pale but peaceful. She looked up at Ethan, her gaze filled with gratitude and love. "My babies?" she whispered. "They're here," Ethan said, his voice soft. He stepped aside so the nurse could hold up the 2 infants, bundled tightly in tiny blankets. "They're safe." A tear slipped down Maria's cheek as her lips curved into a faint smile. She reached out weakly, her fingers brushing against one of the blankets. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for everything." And with that, Maria's eyes closed, her hand falling limp against the bed. The steady beep of the heart monitor turned into a flat line, a sound that echoed through the room like a final goodbye. The room fell silent, save for the soft cries of the newborns. Ethan removed his gloves, his hands trembling slightly as he stepped back from the operating table. He looked at Maria's still form, a pang of sorrow piercing his chest. She had fought until the very end, sacrificing everything for her children. Her strength and love had brought them into the world, and now it was up to him to keep his promise. A nurse gently placed the two babies into Ethan's arms, their tiny faces nestled against the blankets. He looked down at them, his heart heavy, yet filled with a fierce determination. "She gave everything for you," he murmured to the infants, "and I'll make sure you grow up knowing how much she loved you." As Ethan carried the babies out of the operating room, the hospital staff lined the hallway, their faces a mix of grief and reverence. Maria's sacrifice had left an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed it. Victor stood at the end of the hallway, his expression unreadable, as he watched Ethan approach with the babies. For a moment, he looked as if he might say something, but the words never came. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Ethan to fulfill the promise Maria had entrusted to him. The chapter ended not with triumph, but with a bittersweet sense of purpose. Maria was gone, but her legacy lived on in the tiny lives she had fought so hard to protect. Ethan vowed silently to honor her sacrifice and give her children the life she had dreamed for them, a life filled with love, hope, and the memory of their mother's boundless courage. The hospital felt unnervingly quiet in the hours following Maria's passing. The hum of machines and the faint shuffle of nurses' feet seemed distant, drowned out by the heavy weight of loss. Ethan Carter sat in his office, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold on his desk. In his hands, he held two birth certificates, each adorned with tiny inked footprints, Maria's final gifts to the world. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Victor entered, his posture stiff and his expression guarded. He looked like a man who wanted to be anywhere but there. Ethan rose to meet him, his face lined with exhaustion, but his tone steady. "Victor, thank you for coming," Ethan began. He gestured toward the chair across from him, but Victor remained standing. "What is it?" Victor asked, his voice sharp. "If this is about Maria, I don't need another lecture about her sacrifice. I already know how this ends." Ethan ignored the bitterness in Victor's tone and took a deep breath. "I'm here to talk about her children, your niece and nephew. They're healthy but premature, and they'll need special care. Maria fought to bring them into this world. I thought you should be the first to know." Victor shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting toward the certificates on Ethan's desk. "And what exactly do you want me to do about it?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "They need family, Victor. They need someone who will love and care for them." Victor's laugh was hollow, almost cruel. "Family?" he repeated. "Maria made her choice. She decided to risk everything for them. I didn't ask for this. I'm not their father, Ethan. I can barely keep my own life together." "You're their uncle," Ethan said firmly. "Maria trusted you to step up if something happened to her." Victor shook his head. "I never agreed to that. I can't raise kids, let alone two of them." "I'm sorry, but they're not my responsibility." Ethan's expression darkened, and for a moment the room was filled with tense silence. "Not your responsibility?" he said quietly. "Victor, these are Maria's children. They're her legacy. How can you turn your back on them?" Victor's face hardened. "Because I have to. I didn't ask for this, and I won't pretend I can handle it. You're a doctor, Ethan. Find someone else who cares, but it's not going to be me." Without another word, Victor turned and walked out, leaving Ethan alone with the weight of his words. Later that evening, Ethan sat across from his wife, Leona, in their modest kitchen. The twins had been moved to the neonatal unit where they were being closely monitored. Their tiny faces, so fragile yet full of life, had left an indelible mark on him. Leona stirred her tea thoughtfully as Ethan recounted his conversation with Victor. Her face remained calm, but her eyes revealed the turmoil brewing within her. "He just walked away," Ethan said, his voice low, like they didn't matter, like Maria's sacrifice meant nothing. Leona reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on his. "Not everyone is meant to be a parent," she said softly. "But Ethan, maybe we are." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "What are you saying?" Leona met his gaze, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm saying those babies need someone who won't walk away. someone who will love them, fight for them, and honor Maria's sacrifice. We've talked about fostering, about adoption. Maybe this is where we're meant to step in. Ethan's heart swelled as he processed her words. He thought about Maria's fierce determination, her quiet strength, and her unwavering love for her children. The weight of responsibility felt enormous, but for the first time since Maria's passing, a glimmer of hope began to shine. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice filled with equal parts awe and uncertainty. Leona smiled, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I've never been more sure of anything. Those babies deserve a family, Ethan. Let's be that family." Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. The loss of Maria would always linger, but in that moment, he knew her sacrifice had not been in vain. Together, he and Leona would honor her memory by giving her children the love and life she had dreamed for them. The twins, now nestled safely in the NICU, had a future waiting for them, a future shaped by loss, but brimming with promise. "I'm saying we can do this," Leona replied, her voice steady. "Maria's children deserve love. They deserve a family, and if Victor can't give them that, we can." Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. He thought about the long hours at the hospital, the financial strain, the sleepless nights. But then he thought about Maria, her final moments, and the trust she had placed in him. "Hope and Grace," Ethan said suddenly. Leona tilted her head, confused. "What?" "Their names," Ethan explained. "Hope, because that's what Maria gave them. And Grace, because that's what she showed the world." Leona's lips curved into a small smile. "Hope and Grace," she repeated. "It's perfect." In that moment, the decision was made. They would take the twins into their home, into their hearts, and raise them as their own. Days later, Victor stood outside the hospital, staring blankly at the pavement. The weight of his decision gnawed at him, but he refused to acknowledge it. He had always been a man of logic, of practicality, and taking in 2 orphaned infants didn't fit into his carefully constructed life. Yet, as he lit a cigarette with trembling hands, he couldn't shake the image of Maria's face. Her determination, her love, her sacrifice, it haunted him. He thought about the twins, so small and innocent, completely unaware of the chaos that had brought them into the world. Victor exhaled a shaky breath, shoving the cigarette into the dirt. He had made his choice, and he would live with it. But as he walked away, a deep, unspoken regret settled in his chest, a regret that would follow him for the rest of his life. Back at the Carter household, life had taken on a new rhythm. The once quiet home was now filled with the soft cries and coos of newborns, the shuffle of tiny socks and baby blankets, and the warm glow of love that seemed to permeate every corner. Ethan and Leona adjusted quickly to their new roles as parents. Leona spent her days tending to the twins, her heart swelling with every giggle and gurgle. Ethan, despite his long hours at the hospital, made it a point to come home early whenever he could. He would sit by the crib, marveling at the tiny lives that had already taught him so much about courage and resilience. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, Ethan held Hope in his arms while Grace rested against Leona's chest. The room was quiet, except for the soft sounds of the twins breathing. "You think she knows?" Leona asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Knows what?" Ethan replied. "That her babies are safe, that they're loved." Ethan looked down at Hope, her tiny fingers curled around his thumb. "I think she does," he said softly. "Maria fought for them, and now we'll make sure her fight wasn't in vain." As the moonlight filtered through the curtains, Ethan and Leona exchanged a quiet look of understanding. They had taken on a tremendous responsibility, but it felt right. Hope and Grace were more than just children. They were Maria's legacy, a testament to her unyielding love and sacrifice. In the nursery, the twins slept peacefully, their tiny chests rising and falling in unison. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. But within the Carter household, there was a profound sense of purpose, a promise to honor Maria's memory and give Hope and Grace the life she had dreamed of for them. The Carter household was now filled with life and laughter, a stark contrast to the quiet it once knew. Hope and Grace, no longer the fragile newborns they had been, were thriving under the love and care of Ethan and Leona. The twins were inseparable, their bond as strong as the names they bore. Hope, with her curious eyes and endless questions, often climbed onto Ethan's lap during his rare moments of rest. "Daddy," she would ask, her voice filled with wonder, "did Mommy love us a lot?" Ethan would smile, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "More than you'll ever know," he would say, his voice tinged with emotion. Grace, quieter and more introspective, was often found in Leona's arms, her head resting against her adoptive mother's chest. Though she spoke less than her sister, her eyes always seemed to hold a depth of understanding far beyond her years. Ethan and Leona made sure the twins grew up knowing about Maria, not just her sacrifice, but her love, strength, and unwavering determination to bring them into the world. Family dinners often included stories about Maria's courage, leaving Hope and Grace with a profound respect for the mother they had never met. Years passed, and the twins grew into lively, spirited children. One sunny afternoon, they were playing in the park with Leona while Ethan sat on a bench nearby, reading. Hope was chasing a butterfly, her laughter ringing through the air, while Grace tried to build a castle out of fallen leaves. Victor had not seen the twins since the day he walked out of the hospital. He had buried himself in work, convincing himself that his decision had been the right one. Yet, a part of him always wondered about them, what they looked like, if they were happy, and whether Maria would have forgiven him. As he walked through the park that day, Victor's eyes fell on the two children. Something about them stopped him in his tracks. The girl's spirited movements, the boy's quiet grace, it was unmistakable. He watched from a distance, his heart heavy with the weight of his choices. He saw Ethan join them, scooping Grace into his arms while Leona laughed with hope. The family's joy was palpable, a picture of love and unity. Victor's chest tightened as a pang of regret surged through him. He realized that this could have been his chance to honor Maria's memory, to be a part of the lives she had fought so hard to protect. Instead, he had turned his back on them, leaving others to pick up the pieces. Unable to approach them, Victor turned away, his footsteps slow and heavy. The sound of the twins' laughter followed him, a haunting reminder of what he had lost, not just a sister, but a connection to the family he could have been part of. Ethan, glancing up from his book, caught a fleeting glimpse of Victor disappearing into the distance. For a moment, his heart softened with understanding. He knew Victor carried a burden he might never fully confront. But as Hope and Grace ran to him, their faces lit with joy, Ethan was reminded of the gift Maria had left behind, a love so strong that it had created a family bound not by blood, but by choice and devotion. The Carter household was far from perfect, but it was whole. In every laugh, every bedtime story, and every whispered promise, Maria's presence was there, shaping their lives with her enduring love. On a calm, breezy morning, Ethan and Leona took the twins to visit Maria's grave. Hope and Grace, now old enough to understand the significance of the visit, each carried a small bouquet of flowers. The cemetery was quiet, the air filled with the faint rustling of leaves. Ethan knelt beside the headstone, tracing Maria's name with his fingers. "She gave everything for you," he said softly, his voice breaking. "She loved you more than anything in this world." Hope stepped forward, placing her bouquet at the base of the headstone. "Thank you, Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for loving us so much." Grace followed, her smaller hand resting on the stone. "We'll make you proud," she said simply, her words carrying a depth far beyond her years. Leona stood behind them, her arms wrapped around Ethan, tears streaming down her face. "Maria, they're everything you dreamed they would be," she whispered. "Thank you for trusting us with them." As the family left the cemetery, the sky began to clear, and the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm light over the path ahead. Ethan held Hope's hand, while Leona walked beside Grace, her arm protectively draped over the girl's shoulders. The twins chattered excitedly about their plans for the day, their voices carrying a sense of innocence and joy that was infectious. Ethan and Leona exchanged a quiet smile, their hearts full, despite the bittersweet nature of the visit. "Maria would have loved this," Leona said softly, glancing at the children. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "She's a part of them. Every laugh, every smile, they carry her with them." The family continued down the path, their figures bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. Their steps were steady, united by the unshakable bond of love that had grown from Maria's ultimate sacrifice. Hope and Grace walked hand in hand, their laughter echoing across the field. They were Maria's legacy, a testament to her courage, love, and the unwavering belief that even in the face of death, life and hope could prevail. As they disappeared into the distance, the world around them seemed to stand still for a moment, as if paying tribute to Maria's story. Her children were thriving, her memory honored, and her sacrifice not in vain. Hope and Grace had been given a life filled with love, a future shaped by the strength of those who refused to let them fall. They were the embodiment of Maria's hope and grace, living proof that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through. Maria's love didn't end with her life. It became the foundation of her children's future. Through sacrifice and courage, she gave them the gift of hope and grace. Her story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, love has the power to create light, and a legacy built on love can endure forever.